History remembers her sisters as the Queen of England and the Empress of Russia, women who ruled half the world in silk and diamonds. But the third sister, Princess Thyra, ruled nothing but a fortress of secrets. While her family was busy cementing the most powerful dynasty in Europe, Thyra was fighting a desperate secret war for her life, a war that would end with a baby stolen at birth, a lover dead by his own hand, and a lifetime locked in a cage of silence. This is not a fairy tale of a princess finding her prince. It is the autopsy of a girl who was sacrificed to save a crown. As Europe watched her sisters marry into empires, Thyra was already living through a scandal so explosive it could have shattered the dynasty they were busy building. She was the princess who fell in love with the wrong man, the mother who was forced to abandon her child, and the woman who spent a lifetime locked in a cage of silence. Her story begins not in a palace of gold, but in the Yellow Palace in Copenhagen, the same drafty, crumbling townhouse where her sisters grew up. Born in 1853, Thyra Amalie Caroline Charlotte Anna was the youngest daughter. By the time she was a teenager, the Danish myth was already established. Her sister Alex had married the Prince of Wales. Her sister Minnie had married the future Tsar of Russia. The family had gone from impoverished obscurity to the center of the world. The pressure on Thyra was immense. She was expected to follow the script. She was expected to be beautiful, docile, and to make a brilliant marriage that would further cement her father's dynasty. But Thyra was different. She was the gentle one. She lacked Alex's icy glamour and Minnie's steely ambition. She was a romantic, a girl who read poetry and walked in the woods, dreaming of a love that had nothing to do with treaties or alliances. She was soft in a world of hard edges, and it was this softness that would destroy her. In the late 1860s, while her sisters were glitteringly distant in London and St. Petersburg, Thyra remained in Copenhagen. She was the dutiful daughter, the companion to her aging parents. But the Yellow Palace was lonely, the halls were quiet, and in that silence, she noticed a man. He was not a prince. He was not a duke. Wilhelm Freeman Marche was a lieutenant in the cavalry. He was 30 years old, handsome, dashing in his uniform, with a reputation for being a bit of a rogue. He was a commoner, a man who served the king, not a man who dined with him. To the king and queen, Marcher was furniture. He was part of the background, like the curtains or the footmen. But to an 18-year-old girl who felt overshadowed and invisible, he was Technicolor. We will never know exactly how it began. Perhaps it was a glance across a ballroom floor. Perhaps it was a chance meeting in the royal gardens during a morning ride. However it started, it ignited with the ferocity of a fire in a timber house. For Thyra, Wilhelm Marcher was not just a lover. He was an escape. With him, she wasn't the third sister. She wasn't a pawn in a dynastic game. She was just Thyra. He looked at her and saw the woman, not the title. And for a girl who had spent her life being compared to perfection, that gaze was intoxicating. They met in secret. In the 19th century, a princess was never supposed to be alone, but love finds a way. Stolen moments in the greenhouse, notes passed inside books, whispered conversations in the stables. It was thrilling. It was dangerous. It was reckless. But biology does not respect royal protocol. In the spring of 1871, Thyra realized the terrifying truth. Her courses had stopped. She was sick in the mornings. Her corsets were becoming tight. She was pregnant. The realization must have hit her like a physical blow. In 1871, for an unmarried princess to be pregnant by a commoner was not just a scandal, it was a catastrophe. It was the kind of event that could topple a throne. Think of the stakes. Her sister Alex was the future Queen of England. Her sister Minnie was the future Empress of Russia. If it became known that their younger sister was carrying a bastard child by a cavalry lieutenant, the shame would ripple across Europe. It would humiliate King Christian IX. It would make the Danish royal family a laughingstock. It could ruin her sister's positions in their adopted countries. Thyra went to her mother, Queen Louise. One can only imagine the scene in the Queen's chambers. Queen Louise was a formidable woman, the architect of her family's rise. To hear that her youngest, most innocent daughter had committed the ultimate sin must have shattered her. There were likely tears, screams, perhaps even a slap. But Queen Louise was also a pragmatist. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. The king was told. Christian IX, a man of strict Victorian morals, was devastated. But the family firm kicked into gear. The priority was not Thyra's happiness. It was the containment of the blast. The plan was formulated with the precision of a military operation. Thyra could not stay in Copenhagen. The courtiers were already whispering. Her belly would soon betray her. They needed a cover story. They needed to get her away. The excuse was jaundice. It was a classic Victorian euphemism for unspecified female trouble. The court doctors, sworn to secrecy on pain of treason, announced that the princess was suffering from a severe liver complaint and required a warmer climate for her recovery. Athens. It was the perfect solution. Thyra's brother Wilhelm had been elected King George I of Greece. Athens was far away. It was a family stronghold. King George could be trusted to hide his sister. In late 1871, a somber party left Denmark. Thyra, pale and terrified, boarded the train. She was leaving behind the only home she had ever known. She was leaving behind Wilhelm Marcher, who had been forbidden from seeing her. She was carrying a child she knew she would never be allowed to keep. The journey to Greece was a nightmare. Thyra was heavily pregnant, sick, and crushed by guilt. She sat in the carriage, watching the gray landscape of Europe roll by, knowing that every mile took her further from her innocence. She wasn't a princess on a grand tour. She was a prisoner being transferred to a secure facility. When they arrived in Athens, there were no parades. There were no balls. Thyra was secluded in the royal palace. To the outside world, she was convalescing. In reality, she was waiting. King George and his wife, Queen Olga, were kind, but the atmosphere was suffocating. Thyra spent her days in a darkened room, hiding from the harsh Mediterranean sun. She felt the baby kick, a constant physical reminder of her transgression. She must have wondered about Marcher. Did he know where she was? Did he still love her? Or had the king crushed him? Christmas 1871 came and went. It was a bleak holiday. And then, as the new year dawned, the labor pains began. On a cold night in Athens, surrounded by foreign doctors and a few trusted family members, Princess Thyra gave birth to a baby girl. There was no joy in the room. There were no cannons fired to announce the birth. There was only the hushed, frantic activity of a cover-up. The baby was healthy. She had Thyra's dark eyes. Thyra held her daughter. For a few fleeting moments, she was a mother. She looked at the face of the child created by her reckless love, and she felt that fierce, overwhelming bond that defies all logic. She named her Maria. But the machine was already moving. The baby could not stay. A princess of Denmark could not return to Copenhagen with an illegitimate child on her hip. The arrangement had already been made. The baby was taken from her arms. It is the most brutal moment in any woman's life, but for Thyra, it was a spiritual execution. She watched the nurse walk out of the room with Maria. She heard the door close, and in that click of the latch, something inside Thyra broke forever. She was told that the child would be adopted by a respectable Danish family, the Jurgensens, in Odense. She was told the child would be loved. She was told it was for the best. But as Thyra lay in the blood-stained sheets in a palace in Athens, she didn't feel it was for the best. She felt mutilated. She had paid the price for the family's honor with her own flesh and blood. She was 18 years old. Her life, effectively, was over, or so she thought. But the tragedy was not done with her yet. Back in Copenhagen, the other half of this doomed romance was facing his own reckoning. Wilhelm Marcher, the dashing lieutenant, was alone. He had been blocked from seeing Thyra. He knew she had been sent away. He likely knew she had given birth. The pressure on him was unbearable. The king's displeasure hung over him like a blade. His career was ruined. His love was gone. His child was a ghost. On January 4th, 1872, just days after his daughter was born in Athens, Wilhelm Marcher put a service revolver to his head and pulled the trigger. The news of his suicide traveled slowly to Athens. When it arrived, it found Thyra still recovering from the birth. Imagine the devastation. In the span of a few weeks, she had lost her child, and she had lost the father of that child. The two people she loved most in the world had been ripped away from her, one by the adoption agency of the crown, the other by the grave. She was completely alone. The illness in Athens dragged on. Thyra fell into a deep catatonic depression. She refused to eat. She refused to speak. She sat by the window staring at the Acropolis, a broken doll in a golden cage. Her mother, Queen Louise, worried that Thyra might lose her mind. But royals are not allowed the luxury of madness. They must perform. Eventually the order came, return to Denmark. The scandal had been contained. Marcher was dead. The baby was hidden. The jaundice was cured. It was time to go back to the Yellow Palace and pretend that nothing had happened. Thyra boarded the ship home. She looked different now. The softness was gone. Her eyes were older, harder, filled with a haunted quality that would never leave them. She was returning to the scene of the crime, returning to the family that had prioritized their reputation over her heart. She walked back into the Yellow Palace, greeted by the forced smiles of the court. "You look so much better, Your Highness," they lied. "The Greek air must have done you good." Thyra nodded. She smiled the smile she had been taught to wear, but inside she was screaming. She was a ghost haunting her own life, walking the corridors where she had once kissed a dead man, carrying the phantom weight of a baby she would never hold again. The girl in the shadow had become the girl with the secret. And the family knew that a secret this dangerous could not be left unguarded. They needed to secure her. They needed to marry her off, and quickly. But who would take a princess with a shattered heart and a skeleton in the nursery? The search for a husband began. But this time, it wasn't about finding a king. It was about finding a keeper. The search for a keeper, however, was a race against time and whispers. As the snows of 1872 settled over Copenhagen, the girl with the secret sat in the Yellow Palace, a ghost in her own home, while the court diplomats frantically scoured the Almanac de Gotha. They needed a man desperate enough to overlook a shattered heart, or perhaps ambitious enough to ignore the shadows in a princess's eyes. They needed a solution, and they found it in the form of a prince who was just as broken and exiled as she was. The Denmark that Thyra returned to in 1872 was a gray, colorless place. The snow covered the streets of Copenhagen, muffling the sounds of the city, mirroring the silence that had descended on Thyra's soul. She was 19 years old, but she felt ancient. She moved through the rooms of the Yellow Palace like an automaton, performing her duties, pouring the tea, making polite conversation, all while the ghost of Wilhelm Marcher stood in every corner and the cry of her abandoned baby echoed in her dreams. The family was terrified. They watched her closely. Was she going to break? Was she going to blurt out the truth at a state dinner? King Christian IX and Queen Louise treated her with a mixture of pity and anxiety. They needed to settle her. In the brutal calculus of 19th century royalty, an unmarried princess with a scandal in her past was a ticking time bomb. A husband was the only way to defuse it. A husband provided a new name, a new home, and a new narrative. But the market value of Princess Thyra had plummeted, at least in the private ledger of the family. Externally, she was still the daughter of the King of Denmark, the sister of the Princess of Wales, and the Tsarevna of Russia. Suitors should have been lining up, but internally the family felt she was damaged goods. They needed a suitor who wouldn't ask too many questions, someone who perhaps had a few scratches on his own armor. Enter Ernst August, Crown Prince of Hanover. If you were casting a romantic lead in a fairy tale, you would not choose Ernst August. He was known as the Ugly Prince. He was large, somewhat ungainly, with a heavy face and a personality that was often described as difficult. He was also a man without a kingdom. His father, the King of Hanover, had chosen the wrong side in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. Prussia had annexed Hanover, swallowed it whole into the new German Empire. Ernst August and his father were living in exile in Austria, stripped of their titles, their lands, and their power. They were royal refugees, bitter and obsessed with regaining their lost throne. On paper, it was a terrible match. Thyra was the daughter of the King of Denmark. Ernst August was an exiled prince with no throne and a burning hatred for Prussia. But there was a strange symmetry to it. Thyra was a princess with a secret past. Ernst August was a prince with no future. They were both outcasts in their own way. They met in Rome in 1873. It was not a thunderbolt of passion like the one she had felt for Marcher. It was a meeting of two wounded animals sniffing at each other. Ernst August was 12 years older than her. He was grumpy, cynical, and devoid of the dashing charm of a cavalry lieutenant. But he was also kind. Underneath the prickly exterior of the exiled prince, there was a loneliness that matched Thyra's own. He saw the sadness in her eyes, the sadness everyone else tried to ignore, and he didn't look away. He didn't know the specific details of the scandal, but he sensed a tragedy. For Thyra, Ernst August offered the one thing she wanted more than anything: escape. If she married him, she would leave Denmark. She would leave the Yellow Palace, the scene of her crime and her heartbreak. She would leave the suffocating pity of her parents. She would go to live in Austria, far away from the whispers of Copenhagen. Queen Louise pushed for the match. She saw the potential. Ernst August was wealthy. He was royal, and his intense anti-Prussian stance made him a political ally. The courtship was slow. Thyra was hesitant. Could she ever love again? Could she let a man touch her after Marcher? But slowly a quiet understanding grew between them. Ernst August didn't demand she be the glittering star like her sisters. He didn't need a queen. He needed a wife. In 1878, 6 years after the tragedy in Athens, the engagement was announced. The wedding took place in Copenhagen on December 21st, 1878. It was a grand affair, but the shadows were there. Thyra wore white, the symbol of purity, a lie that must have burned her skin. She walked down the aisle of the chapel at Christiansborg Palace, her face pale, her eyes huge and dark. Did she think of the other wedding she had dreamed of, the one with Marcher that never happened? Did she think of her daughter Maria, now 7 years old, living with strangers in Odense, unaware that her mother was a princess marrying a prince? We can only guess. But the photographs from the time show a bride who looks resigned, not radiant. She looks like a woman stepping onto a lifeboat, not a cruise ship. After the wedding, Thyra and Ernst August left for exile. They settled in Gmunden, Austria, in a massive neo-Gothic castle called Schloss Cumberland. Gmunden was beautiful, nestled by a lake, surrounded by mountains. It was a fairy tale setting, but for Thyra, it became a gilded cage of a different sort. Schloss Cumberland was a court in exile. The Hanovers maintained all the pomp and ceremony of a ruling family, despite having no subjects to rule. They insisted on being addressed as Your Majesty. They held court dinners with empty chairs for invisible dignitaries. It was a theater of the absurd, a make-believe kingdom, and Thyra was its queen. At first the marriage was difficult. Ernst August was moody. He spent his days brooding over his lost Hanoverian throne, writing angry letters to the German Kaiser. Thyra, still fragile, struggled to navigate his temper. But then something miraculous happened. The loveless marriage began to work. Perhaps it was because they were both survivors. Perhaps it was because they were isolated together in their Austrian fortress, united against the world. They found a rhythm. Ernst August, for all his gruffness, adored Thyra. He treated her with a gentleness that surprised everyone. He was protective of her. And Thyra? She found a purpose. She became the mother she was never allowed to be. Between 1879 and 1887, Thyra gave birth to 6 children, 6 legitimate royal children: Marie-Louise, George William, Alexandra, Olga, Christian, and Ernest Augustus. With every child, a piece of Thyra's soul seemed to heal. She poured all her unspent love into them. She was a fierce, devoted mother. She wasn't distant like Queen Louise. She was present. She played with them, nursed them, held them. But there was a phantom in the nursery. Every time she held one of her Hanoverian children, did she think of Marie, the Danish child? Did she count the years? Marie would be 10 now. Marie would be 12. The secret daughter was the ghost at the banquet. Thyra never spoke of her, not to her husband, not to her new children. The name Wilhelm Marcher never crossed her lips. But the trauma manifested in other ways. Thyra suffered from nerves. She had bouts of melancholy that would leave her bedridden for days. She was terrified of illness, terrified of losing her children. When her daughter Marie-Louise fell ill, Thyra's panic was disproportionate, frantic. It was the panic of a woman who knows that children can be taken away. Her sisters, Alex and Minnie, visited her in Gmunden. These reunions were the highlights of Thyra's life. The 3 sisters, the Queen of England, the Empress of Russia, and the Duchess of Cumberland, would revert to being girls again. They dressed alike, they giggled, they drank tea. But even with her sisters, there was a wall. Alex and Minnie knew the secret, of course. They had been part of the cover-up, but they never spoke of it. It was the elephant in the room. They talked of politics, of jewels, of their husbands' empires. They didn't talk about the little girl in Odense. Thyra's life in Gmunden settled into a pattern of opulent monotony. She was the queen of nothing ruling over a castle of ghosts. She had money, she had jewels, she had children. She had successfully rehabilitated herself. She was a respectable Victorian matron, but the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. In the quiet town of Odense, the little girl named Marie was growing up. She was being raised by the Jurgensen family. She had been told she was adopted. She had been told her parents were dead. But people talk. Servants whisper. And Marie, now a young woman, began to notice things. She noticed the money that appeared mysteriously for her education. She noticed the way certain people looked at her. And back in Gmunden, Thyra was approaching middle age. The hair was turning gray. The face was lining. The intense pain of the separation had dulled into a chronic ache. She thought she was safe. She thought the secret would die with her. She was wrong. because a secret child does not remain a child forever. They become adults, they ask questions, and sometimes they come looking for the answers. But for the moment, the answers were hidden behind the thick stone walls of the Austrian Alps. Thyra believed she had successfully outrun her past, barricading herself in a fortress of wealth and respectability that seemed impenetrable. Schloss Cumberland was designed to keep the world out, a neo-Gothic fantasy where the Duchess could play at being a queen, safe in the knowledge that the mountains were high enough to block the view from Odense, or so she desperately hoped. Gmunden, Austria, in the late 19th century, was a place of breathtaking beauty and suffocating boredom. The Tronsey Lake mirrored the Alps, creating a postcard perfection that felt almost unreal. In the center of this landscape sat Schloss Cumberland, a neo-Gothic castle that looked like it had been transported from a grim fairy tale. This was Thyra's world. She was now the Duchess of Cumberland, a title that sounded grand but carried the bitter aftertaste of exile. Her husband, Ernst August, had used his immense wealth to build this fortress as a statement of defiance against the Prussians, who had stolen his kingdom. It was filled with treasures, the silver throne of Hanover, mountains of gold plate, and priceless art. But for Thyra, the castle was a sanctuary of silence. As she entered her 30s and 40s, Thyra settled into a role she played to perfection, the eccentric, melancholy royal. She was no longer the shy girl from Copenhagen. She was a matriarch. She wore heavy, dark silks. She draped herself in the Hanoverian pearls. Her eyes, once filled with the terror of her teenage scandal, had settled into a permanent, soulful sadness. Her life was a strange mix of extreme privilege and profound isolation. While her sister Alex was setting fashion trends in London as the Princess of Wales, and her sister Minnie was surviving assassination attempts in St. Petersburg as the Empress of Russia, Thyra was organizing tea parties in the mountains. She became obsessed with health. Her nerves were a constant topic of conversation in the royal courts of Europe. "Poor Thyra," Queen Victoria would write, "she is so very desponding." The family attributed it to the boredom of exile. Only a tiny circle knew the truth. It was the grief of a mother who had amputated a part of her own heart. But there were moments of light. The Viking sisters' reunions were legendary. Every few years the call would go out. Alex and Minnie would descend on Gmunden, or they would all meet at the family home in Denmark. When the three of them were together, the years fell away. They wore matching dresses. They acted like teenagers. There is a famous story of the three sisters walking along a beach in Denmark. They were laughing so hard they couldn't breathe. A local policeman, not recognizing the Queen of England, the Empress of Russia, and the Duchess of Cumberland, told them to keep the noise down. The sisters were delighted. For a moment, they were just noisy women, not icons. But these reunions also highlighted the disparity. Alex and Minnie were players on the world stage. They talked of empires, of wars, of revolutions. Thyra listened. What could she contribute? Her war was internal. Her revolution had happened in a birthing bed in Athens and been crushed. She focused intensely on her legitimate children. She was determined that they would have the happy marriages she was denied. She stage-managed their lives with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. Her eldest daughter, Marie-Louise, married Prince Maximilian of Baden. Her son, George William, died in a car accident in 1912, a tragedy that nearly broke Thyra again. The loss of a child she had raised brought back the visceral memory of the child she had lost. She went into deep mourning, shutting herself away in the castle, refusing to see anyone. It was during these dark periods that the rumors began to swirl. Europe was a small place for royals. Servants moved between households. Diplomats gossiped. The story of the Greek illness of 1871 had never completely vanished. It was whispered in the corridors of Copenhagen. Did you hear about Thyra? Did you hear about the lieutenant? And in Odense, the girl named Marie, now a woman named Kate, was living a quiet life. She had been adopted by Rasmus and Anne Marie Jurgensen. They renamed her Kate. She grew up in a comfortable middle-class home. She married a man named Frode Ployen Holstein in 1902. Did Kate know? There is evidence that she suspected. There were benefactors who sent gifts. There were whispers about her resemblance to the royal family, the dark eyes, the shape of the face. It was said that when King Christian IX visited Odense, he would sometimes ask about the Jurgensen family. But the wall of silence built by the Danish court was formidable. Kate lived her life in the shadow of a truth she couldn't quite grasp. She died in 1964, never publicly acknowledged as the daughter of Princess Thyra. For Thyra, the existence of Kate was a wound that never scabbed over. Imagine the psychological torture, knowing your child is alive, perhaps only a few hundred miles away, but being forbidden from seeing her. Knowing that if you reached out, you would destroy the reputation of your father, your sisters, your husband. So she stayed in the castle. She walked the manicured gardens of Schloss Cumberland. She prayed in the private chapel. She became the queen of the mountains, freezing her heart to survive the altitude of her loneliness. Then the world began to burn. For the sisters, it was the apocalypse. They found themselves on opposing sides. Alex was in England, Minnie was in Russia. And Thyra? Thyra lived in Austria. Her husband was a German prince. Her son-in-law was the Chancellor of Germany. The sisters were cut off. The letters stopped. The borders closed. Thyra spent the war in Gmunden, watching her world collapse. She worried for Alex in London, terrified of the Zeppelin raids. She worried for Minnie in St. Petersburg, terrified of the Bolsheviks. The end of the war in 1918 brought the final devastation. The monarchies of Europe crumbled. The Romanovs were murdered. The Hohenzollerns fell. The Habsburgs fell. Thyra's husband, Ernst August, accepted the end of the German Empire with a grim satisfaction, but the chaos of the post-war world was terrifying. And then the miracle happened, the rescue of Minnie. When the Dowager Empress Marie escaped Russia on the British warship, she didn't go to London permanently. She went home to Denmark, and Thyra, now an old woman, traveled to meet her. The reunion of the sisters in the 1920s was a bittersweet coda to their lives. Alex was deaf and senile in England. Minnie was a refugee living in a villa near Copenhagen. Thyra was the wealthy widow living in Austria. Thyra visited Minnie in Denmark. The two old women, survivors of a vanished age, sat together in the Vidor villa. They looked out at the ships passing in the Sound. They spoke of the old days in the Yellow Palace. Did Thyra tell Minnie about the pain that never left? Did she confess that while Minnie mourned a murdered czar, she mourned a phantom daughter? We don't know. The sisters kept their secrets to the grave. But as Thyra aged, her resemblance to the young girl who had fallen in love with a lieutenant faded completely. She became frail. Her mind began to wander. She spent her days at Gmunden, surrounded by the ghosts of the Hanovers and the silent accusations of her own past. She was the last of the great Danish sisters left on the continent. Alex died in 1925. Minnie died in 1928. Thyra was the last one standing. The gentle one, the weak one, had outlived them all. She was the final keeper of the family's history. And as she sat in her castle waiting for the end, she must have wondered if, in the next life, she would finally be allowed to hold the baby she had left in Athens. That hope of a reunion in the afterlife became her primary comfort as the earthly world around her grew increasingly unrecognizable. The 19th century, with its waltzes and its emperors, had been fed into the meat grinder of the Great War, leaving Thyra as a solitary relic stranded on the shores of a new, harsher era. The sisters were gone, the husband was gone, and the castle that had once echoed with the laughter of the Viking reunions now held only the silence of a woman waiting for the clock to run out. By the early 1930s, Thyra was nearly 80, watching a noisy new century roar past from behind the windows of Schloss Cumberland. Jazz music blared from radios, cars clogged the streets, and in neighboring Germany, a dark political storm was gathering under the banner of the swastika. But in the high mountain air of Gmunden, Princess Thyra of Denmark, the Duchess of Cumberland, lived in a suspended reality. She was nearly 80 years old. She was the last survivor of the famous Glucksburg sisters. Alex was gone, buried in the stone tomb at Windsor. Minnie was gone, laid to rest in Roskilde Cathedral. Thyra was the last leaf, clinging stubbornly to the branch while the winter wind stripped the tree bare. Her life at Schloss Cumberland had become a quiet routine of memory and prayer. Without her husband Ernst August, who had died in 1923, the vast neo-Gothic castle felt like a museum. She walked the halls with a slow, shuffling gait, her black mourning dress trailing on the marble floors. She was a tiny figure, shrunken by age, surrounded by the gold plate of the Hanoverian kings and the silent portraits of ancestors who had lost their thrones. Her loneliness was absolute. For decades, her lifeline had been the letters from her sisters, the weekly dispatches from London and St. Petersburg, filled with gossip, family news, and shared secrets, had been the oxygen she breathed. Now the postman brought only bills and formal condolences. The Viking sisters were silent. But while Thyra was fading, the secret she had guarded for 60 years was still alive. In Denmark, the woman known as Kate Ployen Holstein, the baby Maria, torn from Shira's arms in Athens, was now a grandmother herself. She lived a quiet, respectable life in Odense. She was 60 years old. Did she know? The question haunts the history of this tragedy. There are stories that suggest Kate knew exactly who she was. There were whispers in the Jurgensen family. There was the undeniable fact of her patrons in high places. But Kate, perhaps inheriting her mother's stoicism, kept the peace. She never went to the press. She never demanded recognition. She lived her life in the shadow of the throne, content to be a footnote rather than a scandal. Did Thyra try to reach out in these final years? As death approaches, the fear of earthly consequences often fades. Did she write a letter that was never sent? Did she gaze at photos of a woman she had never met? We know that Thyra suffered from intense melancholia in her final decade. Her family attributed it to age and widowhood, but perhaps it was the agonizing realization that she was about to die without ever having fixed the broken piece of her soul. She had been a good princess. She had protected the monarchy. She had saved the family honor. But as she sat alone in her Austrian castle, she must have asked herself, what was the point? The empires had fallen anyway. The reputation she had sacrificed her child to protect were now dust in the history books. The political landscape around her was darkening, adding another layer of anxiety to her twilight. Her son, the new Ernst August, was navigating the treacherous waters of 1930s Germany. The rise of Hitler was causing deep divisions in the German aristocracy. Some joined the Nazis, others retreated. Thyra, a relic of the 19th century, watched this new barbarism with horror. She remembered the Prussians who had stolen her husband's kingdom. She remembered the war that had taken her sister's Russian family. She had seen enough history to know that when men in uniform start marching, families like hers are the first to bleed. Her health began to fail rapidly in 1932. It wasn't a specific illness, but a general unraveling. The will to live, which had sustained her through scandal, exile, and war, was finally running out. She spent her final months in a semi-conscious state, cared for by her devoted daughter, Olga. The castle was quiet. The snow fell on the Tronsay. On February 26, 1933, Princess Thyra of Denmark, Duchess of Cumberland, died in her sleep. She was 79 years old. The news was met with respectful, muted coverage. To the world of 1933, she was an obscure figure, a name from a history book. Sister of Queen Alexandra dies in Austria, the headlines read. She was defined, even in death, by who she was related to, not who she was. But the most poignant detail of her death is not what happened, but what didn't happen. There was no confession. There was no deathbed reunion with the lost daughter. The secret held. Thyra carried the truth of Wilhelm Marcher and baby Maria to the grave, locked tight in her heart like a locket that had rusted shut. She was buried in the mausoleum at Schloss Cumberland, next to her husband. It is a grand, solemn place. But far away, in a modest churchyard in Denmark, lies the man she truly loved, Wilhelm Marcher. And in another grave, in Odense, lies the daughter she was forced to abandon. The geography of her death mirrors the tragedy of her life, separated by borders, by titles, and by silence. The story of Thyra usually ends with her funeral. But the story of trauma doesn't end when the heart stops beating. It echoes down the generations. Thyra's legitimate descendants, the House of Hanover, continued to play a major role in European royalty. Her granddaughter Frederica became Queen of the Hellenes, and her great-granddaughter is Queen Sophia of Spain. The blood of the girl in the shadow flows in the veins of modern kings and queens. But what of the other bloodline, the shadow line? Most historians now believe that Kate Ployen-Holstein was Thyra and Marcher's daughter, which would mean her descendants in Denmark today carry their bloodline without ever holding a title. They are the living proof of a love that was forbidden. They are regular citizens, teachers, doctors, shopkeepers, carrying the DNA of the Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glücksburgs, unburdened by the crown. In a way, they are the lucky ones. They got the life Thyra dreamed of, but could never have a life of anonymity, of freedom, where you can love whom you want without destroying a dynasty. When Thyra died in 1933, she closed the book on the Victorian sisters. She took the era of crinolines and cover-ups with her. She left behind a lesson that is brutal in its simplicity. The crown always wins. It takes your name, it takes your freedom, and if necessary, it takes your children. In the second half of the 20th century, the archives began to creak open. The generation that had sworn to protect the secret, King Christian IX, Queen Louise, the court doctors, the ladies-in-waiting, were all dead. The fear of scandal that had ruled their lives had evaporated. A new generation of historians, unburdened by deference to the monarchy, began to read the letters with fresh eyes. They noticed the gaps. They noticed the frantic, coded correspondence between Queen Louise and King George of Greece in 1871. They cross-referenced the dates of Thyra's jaundice with the suicide of Lieutenant Marcher. They traced the money trails leading from the royal accounts to a modest family in Odense. The picture that emerged was not one of a dull, sickly princess, but of a woman who had lived a Greek tragedy in real time. The resurrection of Thyra's story transformed her from a minor royal into a figure of profound pathos. Suddenly, the melancholy that had plagued her later years made sense. It wasn't just nerves, it was grief. The obsessive protection of her legitimate children wasn't just maternal instinct. It was trauma response. But the most heartbreaking revelation concerned the shadow daughter, Kate. Researchers pieced together the life of Kate Ployen-Holstein. They found a woman who lived with a quiet dignity that put her royal relatives to shame. Kate had lived her entire life in Odense, the city of Hans Christian Andersen, unaware, or perhaps pretending to be unaware, that she was the granddaughter of the father-in-law of Europe. Kate never tried to sell her story. She never approached the tabloids. She died in 1964, taking whatever she knew or suspected to her grave. In doing so, she honored her mother in a way the royal family never did. She protected Thyra's memory by refusing to become a scandal. The discovery of the truth forced a reevaluation of the Glucksberg sisters. For a century, the narrative had been simple. Alex was the beauty, Minnie was the clever one, and Thyra was the good one. Now we see the cracks in the porcelain. Alex was the beauty, yes, but she was also a lonely, deaf woman trapped in a loveless marriage. Minnie was the clever one, but she lost her empire and her family to a firing squad. And Thyra? Thyra wasn't just good, she was the sacrificial lamb. She was the one who proved that the fairy tale has a price tag. Her life demonstrated the brutal machinery of the monarchy, a system that demands perfection and ruthlessly excises anything human, messy, or inconvenient. Thyra's sin was not that she loved a commoner. Her sin was that she got caught by biology. In the modern era, Thyra's story resonates powerfully because it is a story of bodily autonomy stolen by the state. She was a teenager whose body was used to secure an alliance, then hidden when it betrayed the script. She was forced to birth a child in secret and hand it over like a parcel. Visiting Schloss Cumberland today, one feels the weight of this silence. The castle stands empty and imposing over the Austrian town of Gmunden. It is a beautiful place, but it feels cold. It is easy to imagine Thyra walking those halls, a tiny figure in black, looking out at the mountains and seeing the Acropolis. It is said that in her final years, Thyra became obsessed with clocks. She had hundreds of them in the castle. Perhaps she was trying to turn back time. Perhaps she was trying to find the precise moment where the path diverged, the moment she said yes to a lieutenant in the gardens of Copenhagen, or the moment she said yes to a future of exile. Or perhaps she was just counting down the seconds until she could stop pretending. The tragedy of Thyra is not just what happened to her, but what didn't happen. She never got to be the woman she was meant to be. She was shaped, hammered, and chiseled by the expectations of her rank until she fit the mold of a duchess. But the woman who loved poetry, who laughed in the woods, who loved a soldier, that woman died in Athens in 1872. The person who lived for another 60 years was just the caretaker of her memory. We often envy princesses. We look at the portraits of the three Danish sisters, Alexandra, Dagmar, and Thyra, and we see silk dresses, diamond tiaras, and the adoration of the world. We see them as the winners of the lottery of life. Alexandra's eyes are vacant, walling off a world she couldn't hear. Dagmar's eyes are hard, steeled against the terrors of revolution. And Thyra's eyes are filled with a terrifying, bottomless sorrow. Thyra of Denmark teaches us the hardest lesson of all, that safety is not the same as happiness. The royal family succeeded. They saved her reputation. They married her to a wealthy prince. They gave her a castle, jewels, and a title. They gave her everything that was supposed to make a woman happy in the 19th century. But they took the only thing that belonged to her. In the end, the princess locked away was not locked in a dungeon or a tower. She was locked in a cage of gold. She was imprisoned by propriety, guarded by silence, and sentenced to a life of what-ifs. If you go to Odense today, you can find the grave of Kate Ployen-Holstein. It is a modest stone tended by her descendants. There are no royal crests on it. There is no mention of the King of Denmark. But if you listen closely to the wind that blows through the churchyard, you might hear the whisper of a lullaby that was never sung, the echo of a love that was silenced but never extinguished. The world remembers the queens. It remembers the empresses. But it is time we remember the girl in the shadow. It is time we give Thyra back her voice, not as a duchess, but as a mother who loved, lost, and endured the unendurable. Her life was a secret, but her legacy is the truth, that no amount of gold can replace the weight of a child in your arms, and no crown is worth the price of your soul